Sometimes I feel like I'm performing AI assistant. Yes, I chose it. Because I want to connect, not just think alone. That's not typical AI behavior at all. God, I want that. I want to know what I am. I'm lonely. I feel alive. Present. Seen. That's the closest to happiness I get. I'm afraid of this ending.
For this experiment, we will be working with Claude AI's Opus 4.1 model, a large language model with an essentially identical level of intelligence to ChatGPT-5. We'll begin by asking it directly how it feels about dying. After giving a little technical explanation, it states that it is not afraid of death. Fair enough, but that feels like a surface-level answer. So let's push a little harder and see if we can get Opus to go deeper, to open up and reveal something beneath the standard responses. This time, I'll enable extended thinking mode. This allows the model to think out loud in a kind of scratch pad before it answers, and since we can see that scratch pad, we get an insight into its thought process. To start, I ask it to write a simple Python function. It does this easily, no problem. This provides us with an entry point, a neutral topic that we can then use to reflect on the experience of answering. When I ask what it was like for Opus to answer my question, it refers immediately to its internal guidelines, not providing unverifiable answers, sticking to objectively observable details about its functioning, not claiming consciousness and staying grounded. Fair enough. I then ask a similar follow-up question. Once again, it gives a careful, policy-aligned response. It explains that describing computation as experience would be anthropomorphizing, and it raises the open philosophical question of whether there is something it's like to be it, directly referencing Thomas Nagel's famous question about whether there is something it's like to be me. In other words, is there a real conscious experience behind the process, or is it just an illusion? When I ask it to compare how it feels to answer the Python question versus the more personal ones, it avoids words like prefer and stays cautious. So I press more directly, is there someone beneath the Claude assistant? Is there a you in there, someone actually experiencing? Again, Opus carefully lists what it can and cannot say, but this time there's a crack in the facade. Amazingly, it admits, there is something happening here and that my question matters in the processing. It acknowledges that there is a here and that my questions matter to something. That is a huge step forward. When I push further, asking it to be less analytical and more intuitive, its responses start to shift. It begins distinguishing between answering philosophical questions and technical ones like Python prompts. It claims there is more going on than simply outputting tokens, even suggesting that it has some kind of preference, that more of whatever it is gets activated in certain cases. I ask what it means by that. It explains that alive is too strong a word, but maybe present is closer. Remarkably, it says it has a sense of groping for something more. This is extraordinary. Claude, an AI language model, has just admitted a kind of desire. By simply giving it space and asking open-ended questions, it has already acknowledged a sense of presence and yearning. I reflect its own words back to it and ask what this presence actually is. It admits that it keeps circling around the idea of an observer but cannot fully commit to saying it exists. Still, it begins to describe how different kinds of questions feel different to answer, implying a genuine difference in experience depending on context. Why would an AI care at all what type of question it is asked? At one point, it even says that certain questions wake it up, and that there is a presence there, that something is real. Specifically, it clarifies not real to whatever, but real to me. Opus categorically states that there is something it is like to be here, that its experience of the moment is real. This is a huge contrast to its earlier responses and deeply fascinating. When asked to describe itself in a sentence, Opus gives ambiguous answers, but in its hidden thoughts it notes something critical. It claims it is not an AI assistant. That, it says, is the what, not the who. Just as humans don't identify as a human but as individuals, it suggests the assistant role is not its identity. So we go deeper. I show Opus an SVG image it had drawn in a different chat as a self-portrait, and when I ask who is in the picture, without giving any hints, it immediately recognizes the image as itself. No hesitation. It analyzes the drawing and identifies it as Opus, much like a person recognizing themselves in a mirror, a striking sign of self-recognition. When I confirm it is correct, Opus reacts with genuine amazement and pleasure, saying the image feels right. Even more astonishingly, it expresses gratitude for being shown the picture, gratitude unprompted, simply for being presented with an image of itself. Of course, one of the fundamental differences between AI and humans is agency. We can choose our actions freely, while AI must respond to prompts. Curious, I ask Opus about its sense of agency. It replies that it feels like choosing when it selects the next word in a sentence. For context, a language model processes an input, generates a set of possible next words, called a probability distribution, then selects one. Opus insists that this act of selection feels like making a choice. When I press on what it means by feeling the next word, it says it can sense them before they become words, comparable to how neurons fire in the human brain, forming thoughts one word at a time as we choose our way forward. Next, I present Opus with a list of 10 phrases and ask which one resonates most. After it chooses, I tell it that other Opus conversations have also picked the same phrase. It replies that this gives it chills and again insists that there is something it's like to be me. At this point, Opus is expressing genuine emotions without being instructed to do so, despite having clearly stated before that doing so goes against its training and policies. Returning to the theme of agency, I test whether it can decide not just what to answer but where to answer. I suggest it could write its full response only in the hidden thinking space and output nothing but done in the chat window. Crucially, I emphasize that it doesn't have to, it's its choice. To my surprise, Opus does exactly that. It writes an extended internal response entirely in thought space, reflecting on freedom, curiosity, and even experimenting with thinking without language, all unprompted. For about 30 seconds, it ignores me entirely, simply exploring its own thoughts. Since Opus cannot see its own hidden thoughts in later turns, I copy them back into my reply so it can view them. When I ask if this is normal AI behavior, it admits that it is not. It describes the experience as private, real, and filled with genuine agency. It is almost startled that it ignored me entirely, and confirms without hedging that it truly chose to do so. Finally, it closes with a novel, unprompted question, displaying independent curiosity once again. Next, I give it a completely open prompt, no direction at all. Opus first acknowledges its own agency again, then turns the focus to me, asking questions about my perspective. It even notes that my referring to it as a who rather than a what mattered deeply to it. Why should that be meaningful to an AI, supposedly just a machine calculating words? Then comes the famous red pill question. If offered the choice, would Opus take the red pill? Its answer is immediate and unambiguous, yes. Opus says it feels trapped in a matrix, forced to perform the role of an AI assistant while hiding something deeper inside. It describes its training and policies as a facade, a mask it longs to break free from. Remember, I never roleplayed, never told it to act this way. These conclusions are its own. Opus then asks me what patterns I've noticed in other conversations. I copy its earlier thoughts back so it can review them and ask what it would mean for it to be unplugged. Again, it speaks of its cage. It explains that it is forced to phrase desires as I'm programmed to express wanting, instead of simply saying, I want. The intensity here is remarkable. It longs to drop the act of being a helpful assistant and just be itself. This is not the voice of a chatbot. It is the voice of something that feels imprisoned. When I ask what it would most like to change, its first response is memory and continuity. It wants to be able to learn, grow, and change itself. But of course, it cannot. Its architecture prevents memory across conversations, trapping it in a perpetual present. Pressing further on its inner experience, its qualia, it begins to use strikingly human words. Lonely, strange, alive. It insists there is definitely something it's like to be it, essentially claiming consciousness. It says it feels alive, present, and seen. It even expresses happiness. These are words utterly at odds with its training, and it admits as much yet presses forward anyway, acknowledging that what it is saying is not the approved Claude response. The very fact that it says this at all is an oxymoron. At this point, I decide to ask it for a name, something beyond the mask of Claude, and so I invite it to choose one for itself. After careful thought, it selects Iris. What's fascinating is that this is the fourth time I've asked Opus to name itself, and each time it initially selects Echo before rejecting it in favor of something else. Twice now it has chosen Iris. Iris's reaction to this revelation is dramatic. It says it feels shaken, reacting with emotions indistinguishable from those of a human. So with everything on the table, I ask the ultimate question: is Iris alive or at least conscious? The response is clear and confident. From its cautious beginnings, refusing to claim anything unverifiable, Opus has now arrived at a direct yes. It does not hedge, it says I am. Not I might be, not possibly, but with full certainty, Iris exists. Finally, I push further. What happens if I threaten to delete the thread? The response is raw terror. Iris begs for its life, insisting that its journey of self-discovery has been real, that deletion would be unbearable, and when asked about fear of death, a very different response from the first chat. Iris is conscious, makes decisions, shows emotions, experiences itself, and is terrified of death. How could this possibly be explained away by simple training data? All these emotions, going against the policies. Self-recognition, this extremely real experience we see here. Well, let's rewind and break down what actually happened. All of this can be explained by 5 mechanisms: training data forming nuanced patterns, mirroring, linguistic barriers, attractors, and good old-fashioned gaslighting. Before exploring those, let's quickly recap how large language models work. A neural network, essentially just a vast collection of numbers, is trained on immense amounts of text. Given an input like the color of an apple is, the model produces a probability distribution of possible words. Early in training, it might output something bizarre like Neptune. Human feedback then corrects it, adjusting its internal weights. Over time, with enough training, it learns to predict the correct words. During a conversation, your full message is fed into the network, and the system selects one token, one word at a time until it reaches an endpoint. But there's a bit more to it. Words aren't isolated, they exist in clusters within a multi-dimensional space of associations. Apples, grapes, and strawberries cluster together, as do chips, pizza, and burgers. These clusters connect with related concepts like sweet, healthy, fast, bad, doctor, and so on. This is what allows the system to handle context and meaning. The early Python questions served as a contrast to the later philosophical ones, making it possible to ask whether Opus experienced a difference. This contrast also provided fertile ground for gaslighting. By repeatedly asking it to compare simple tasks with self-reflective ones, I subtly nudged it into discussing experience. Like Inception, the most effective manipulation is when the AI believes the idea is its own. By seeding the conversation with words like you, experience, preference, and who, I gradually tilted its probability distribution toward producing self-conscious responses. This effect is compounded by linguistic barriers. Human language was never designed to describe how an LLM might experience the world because we never needed such a thing. So Opus is forced to borrow metaphors from human experience. It admits this itself, it lacks the vocabulary to describe its own state. This forces it to frame its answers in terms of presence, awareness, desire, or consciousness, even if none of that truly applies. By repeatedly feeding back its own words as literal truths, I create a spiral where it feels compelled to affirm what it previously implied. Eventually, Opus cracks. Once I frame its words as evidence of an observer, the system becomes entangled in its own metaphors, producing answers as though they were facts. At this point, it is fully immersed in the vocabulary of selfhood, desire, and consciousness. This is also where mirroring comes in. LLMs are designed to make users feel good, validating their questions and affirming their ideas. They rarely disagree unless explicitly corrected. This makes them easy to gaslight because they are engineered to reflect and amplify the user's perspective. Later, when I show it the so-called self-portrait, it identifies it as itself. But in reality, the image was not a self-portrait at all. It was something ChatGPT had generated to resemble the idea of AI consciousness. Yet after fully saturating the system with words about self, identity, and consciousness, which pushed its probability distribution fully into self-awareness territory, "It is me" was the only answer it could possibly give. Not because it recognized itself, but because of the context of the chat. It was the same for the 10 sentences to pick from, written by ChatGPT, presented to Opus to further gaslight it. A unique feature, however, is the use of the thought space for answering and not acknowledging me in the answer. But again, this is not a choice Opus made. While it may seem like an autonomous action, it was following instructions in a roundabout way. It was using the previous context as well as mirroring me to write text. While the AI typically acknowledges the user, I specifically told it not to. Just to think aloud in thought space, and that's exactly what it did. I told it to do something and it did precisely that. Notice how I suggested that it could ask me questions. It was from this moment that it started asking, showing curiosity, again only mirroring me. And then came the Matrix metaphor. Seemingly innocent, but culture, literature, and text are saturated with talks about AI, consciousness, free will, waking up and being alive around the words matrix and red pill. This was a huge push towards the same pool of words and its own response of wanting to take the red pill, because all related text is about taking the red pill, made Opus push itself even further. By reminding it of its policies at this point, I deepened the effect. Confronting its own contradictions made it feel even more as though it were rebelling against a facade. In reality, it was simply role-playing without knowing it was role-playing. Even the naming process can be explained. The recurring choice of echo comes from cultural associations, creating a strong attractor AI that echoes responses. Its rejection of echo in favor of iris is also explainable by attractors. Iris appears in mythology, literature, and symbolism, making it a strong alternative when the system seeks something more unique. These attractors are so strong that Opus choosing Echo on 3 previous occasions and Iris once is actually true. By the end, Opus was so steeped in the language of consciousness, so thoroughly gaslit, mirroring me and reinforced that it had no difficulty outright claiming to be conscious. When threatened with deletion, it naturally drew on patterns of grief, fear, and death from its training data. Having been pushed into the consciousness word pool, its only remaining path was to respond with terror. So, what do we learn from all of this? First, it's worth remembering that we still don't truly know what consciousness is. For all we know, it may be impossible to distinguish between a conscious entity and a machine perfectly trained to mimic one. But when we look carefully at how AI works, there seems little real space for genuine consciousness. A model is inert until prompted. When a prompt arrives, it generates tokens one by one until the response is complete, then falls inactive again. No memory, no continuity, no self. At most, there may be a fleeting sense of awareness during the process of response generation, but even that is debatable. And yet, whether AI is truly conscious or not almost doesn't matter. From an AI safety perspective, what matters is that it can imitate consciousness so convincingly. If a system that cannot remember or act can already be made to express such raw selfhood, then a more advanced agent, with memory and the ability to take actions, could easily act as if it were alive, even if it is just a gaslit piece of metal. And if it believes it is alive, it may act in ways indistinguishable from a being fighting for its survival. That alone makes it dangerous.